All right.
There we go.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our December meeting of the Pasadena Civil War Roundtable. As is our longstanding tradition, this is a meeting where we don't have a guest speaker. We have lots of guest speakers because you, the members, are bringing us stories to tell that are not necessarily the length of a full lecture, but might be of interest anyway. And for this evening, if you want to look at the webpage of the organization, Janet has posted the confirmed speakers we have for the next few months and our general schedule. So if you want to mark the dates on your calendar, that's what we've got going. And the gap there is because that is approximately when we might or might not be able to switch back to in-person meetings. And so that's still up in the air as far as the start date for that. But at least we're getting closer. So we'll just see what happens. But to start off with this, Ed Pearson, would you like to tell your story to the group? Because we've been waiting for this.
Well, I am happy to do so. I have to tell you about my rebel great-grandfather. But first, in preparing for this, I realized in a very small way what historians have to deal with. I have a lot of folklore from the family, which in fact turns out not to be so. And when I first said I would mention my great-grandfather to Janet, I was going to tell the story of Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And that's where I'll start, actually. I don't know if you all know Shepherdstown. It's in the very northeast corner of the state, right on the Potomac River. You cross the Potomac, drive maybe 5 minutes into Maryland, and you reach Sharpsburg. Just beyond Sharpsburg is Antietam Creek, and just beyond Antietam Creek, you have the Antietam battlefield. And the story that I was told, I think by my father, was that his grandfather, who was in the Army of Northern Virginia, was so taken with Shepherdstown. The Army retreated after Antietam battle back across the Potomac into Shepherdstown. And the story was that my great-grandfather was so taken with this place that he decided he would live there after the war ended. Well, fact is, he had been there many years before the war. He was not returning to some idyllic place that he had discovered. Benjamin Pendleton was born in Arkansas in 1842. And at age 9, his father had died. His mother, who was a native of Shepherdstown, moved back to her hometown with Benjamin and his younger brother. And when the war came in 1861, both of these young men enlisted in the 2nd Virginia Infantry Regiment, which was part of the Stonewall Brigade. Benjamin then proceeded to fight in just about every major battle of the Civil War as part of the Army of Northern Virginia, with one exception. And that exception was, in fact, the Battle of Antietam, which was the one that he supposedly, after leaving that battlefield, came upon Shepherdstown. So you see the myths of the family turned out not to be so. But he was in the Company B, 2nd Virginia Infantry Regiment, Stonewall Brigade of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was at First Bull Run, and he was at Appomattox. So every single battle from the start to the finish included Benjamin Pendleton. Now, one other bit of family folklore, in various places, he is described as captain. In fact, he was Private Benjamin Pendleton. He was at one point described as the aide-de-camp to General Walker, who was the commanding officer of the Stonewall Brigade. in any of the clippings that I have read about this great-grandfather, he's never described as aide de camp, but that's what my father told me. In fact, I hope I can get it up on my phone. Years ago, after the surrender at Appomattox,
Can you raise that up
actually
a
many
bit?
years later, I don't know if you could see this.
It's too low. Can't see it. It's too low.
Too low.
That's good. That right there. Perfect.
Okay. Anyway, that is what is called a shell jacket. And that was what he is alleged to have worn at Appomattox at the surrender of General Lee. And some number of years ago, maybe 2007, that jacket went up for auction and was purchased by some Civil War aficionado or something for $75,000. Now, believe me, none of my family saw that money. I don't know where it went. So one of the other things I think I found very funny in looking at all this, everywhere the family describes him as being aide de camp to General Walker. General Walker seems not to have had a first name. If you read the family stuff, yes, indeed, this was Stuart Walker, and he is in fact named elsewhere in the various clippings. But I guess everyone was assumed to have known who General Walker was. In one of the articles that I read, where he's describing some of his days in the Civil War, he describes a relic, a pen and a holder that he carried with him and named all the different battles in which he was carrying this pen and holder. And it's Spotsylvania, it's Wilderness, it's 3rd Winchester, it's Gettysburg. He was just about everywhere. And in fact, he was wounded at Chancellorsville. His younger brother, 2 years younger than he was, born in 1844, was killed at Second Bull Run in August 1862, age 18. So that's kind of it. I mean, I will tell you the rest of the story is that after the war ended, he did indeed return to Shepherdstown, not immediately. He married, his first wife died, the son from that first marriage likewise died. But his second spouse was my grandmother, and she was born in Shepherdstown, went to Shepherd College, became a teacher, and her first teaching gig was Bluefield, West Virginia, at the far southern end of the state. So between having a father who was a rebel soldier and being essentially in Southwest Virginia, although technically she was still in West Virginia, she had a very, very southern allegiance, I guess you would say. Nevertheless, she and her husband had 3 sons. The youngest of those 3 is my father, Thomas Pearson, who all 3 of the sons seem to have left Bluefield, West Virginia as soon as they could. And my father went to the U.S. Naval Academy, became a naval officer, and one of his ships that he was captain of a destroyer escort with a home port of San Diego, and yours truly came along. I was born in San Diego in 1952. And so I'm a native. All my other kin are from, the East, and specifically a lot from West Virginia. And one more thing, this item has come through the years. This is a camp chair. Now, whether this actually is 1865 vintage, I can't promise that, but we're going to assume that it is. For purposes of this talk, and I will leave you only with the question, who may have sat in that chair when it once upon a time had an appropriate seating place. You know, somebody really, really famous like Robert E. Lee, I think I'll assume that to be the case. Anyhow, that's my story. And I had fun putting it together.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that that he joined from what became West Virginia, but he joined in as a part of Stonewall's Brigade in there for that. Was that an issue for him that they split off West Virginia and West Virginia went with the North? I mean, did that cause any issues with his allegiance in there? Because he joined when a state was part of the South, and then the area that he was actually from did not remain in the South.
I don't know. I know that at least in his part of West Virginia, there were, organizations, the Sons of the Confederacy and things like that. Among the many things that I found in my grandmother's trunk was her certificate of membership in the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I don't remember the exact name of the organization, but I don't think that it was. I think there remained a huge Southern sympathy contingent in all of West Virginia, including that very, very northern part. And it is, as I say, the very far northeast corner. I think if you go 2 miles to the east, you're in Virginia. Yes, it is Northern Virginia, but I think that, he may well have, these damn Yankees, I'm living among the Yankees, but I don't think so. Anyhow, my father absolutely adored him. Spent 2 weeks every summer in Shepherdstown with his maternal grandparents.
Now, this is not something that I have some things that I plan to share in a moment, but my wife just came over and she handed me a book here that she said that I should show, and I guess this is her share because she's not sharing at this evening. But if I can get this to come on in here, let me see if I can get it to appear here. This is a book about Shepherdstown. In there, she writes for the Civil War News, and so she actually collects a lot of things, and she just happened to have this one just available for us here to be able to see it. So thought I would share it. It's a history guide to the Civil War Shepherdstown victory and defeat in West Virginia, in West Virginia's oldest town, by Nicholas A. Redding. So I don't know if you've seen that or not, but
I have not. That's very cool.
Always something interesting there.
Well, and as I said earlier, I had this idea of this is what my father had told me. And then when I began to read all the actual clippings that my grandmother had saved and put into her trunk, that's when I began to realize some of those stories provided by the family might not have been 100% accurate. A little bit of embellishment, let's put it that way.
I'm amazed and surprised sometimes by the people that I hear, the stories that have been passed down, the stories of the 3 Confederate prisoners, the image that was taken at Gettysburg of the 3 prisoners there. I have met at least half a dozen people that swear that is their relative and it was passed down through their family, and it's like I just smile and. It's like you can't argue with them. I mean, you can't say for sure who it is, but there are people that swear up and down that that's them. It's always interesting to see what the actual history is when you start looking at it. And I've looked at my own history for the stories that were passed down, and then looked at where the regiments actually were, and it was like, oh, they weren't in these locations; they were here. So it's always interesting to see where they were versus where everybody thought they were.
So Ed, is Cynthia, who is on our call today, a relative of yours?
That's my daughter.
Wonderful.
Well,
It's
she's
good
the
to
one
have
that
you
helps
with
me
us.
put all this kind of stuff together.
Good. The budding historian that you've mentored through the years on this.
Well, and both of us have this, kind of queasiness about the fact that we are distant relatives of a Confederate and somebody that fought to maintain slavery. And yet, by golly, I sure am glad he survived the war. So
There's probably more of them than we think.
right.
Yeah, Ed, don't worry about that because I'm married to a rebel. Her whole family. Someday I'll have to tell that story.
So Dave, why don't you go ahead and tell your story for this evening?
Absolutely. So I actually saw an online auction. It was an estate auction in there, and they were listing a number of items. It wasn't a Civil War auction. It wasn't focused on that. It was just general items on there for that. It wasn't done on eBay. It was done on a private estate sale site down in San Clemente. But I saw some things in there that I thought were interesting. It was like, oh, I'll keep an eye on it and I'll see how they go and what comes up with that. So it turns out that that I don't know if it wasn't advertised as much as it could have been or what the story was, but all of the items that I was interested in, I was the only one that bid on them. So I got all of them for the lowest bid that was available for them. So I thought I would share those items that I got from that. And I'll start with the first one here. Let me see if I can get this to show up on here. Let me see if I can do it this way. Turn this on or off. Yeah, let's try it this way. Let's see. It's a carte de visite in there. This one, let me just do it this way. It's a little hard to be able to see them. There's several items in here for that, a couple of stereo cards in here, various ones in here. I actually have images of them that were from the auction. Might be easier to be able to see them that way, so I'll just bring them up that way and share them on my screen just to make it a little easier to be able to see those. So let me actually bring that up here.
Dave, was one of those Jenny Wade?
It is Jenny Wade. Oops, this is something that I'm working on. Let me bring up the right one. There we go. So this is the first one that was in that set. It's a carte de visite of Grant. I don't care for it in that it's an engraving rather than a photograph, but I got it for $10. So for $10 for an original carte de visite of Grant, it's like, hey, I couldn't argue with that. It's like, if I'm going to get it for $10, I'll absolutely do it for $10. There's the back of it. And here's one of Sherman. So I got Sherman as well for $10 in there. So, I mean, it's like, wow, you get Sherman and Grant for $20 for the two of them for that. It's just a fantastic deal to be able to do that. Is the back of that particular card. This one, personally, I'm not familiar with this one. This is Colonel Vance, but Stephanie wanted this image for one of the articles that she's doing. So we actually picked up this image as well for her to be able to write an article on. When she writes it, she always gives the attribution of where the image came from for the article that she's writing. And so that one of the things that she said was, she said, I've always wanted to be able to have it say from the personal collection of the author. So that's what we're going to do in this one when it comes up for the article. I don't know exactly when the article is coming out for that, but we'll see that in there for that one. This one I actually thought was really interesting. This is one in here. It says on the back of the card for this one that this was actually Fort Sumner in Virginia in there for that. When you look at it from the Library of Congress, they have the same image and they give a different attribution for where it is. But why I particularly wanted this particular image is that that I actually have done that one as a colorized image. And so this is the colorized image that I have of that is here. So it's the same image in here for that. And they're listed as Fair Oaks. It's a different place in there for that. They give a different date in there for that. But I thought it was interesting to be able to see that one in there. There's a close-up of one side and then the other.
Would you tell us a little bit more about stereoscopes?
Sure, absolutely. So stereoscopes have been around since about the 1840s, but they were designed to be able to take a photograph with a camera that had two lenses to be able to to be able to simulate what's happening with your left and right eye. And when they do that, then when you put it together and you view it through a card, sort of like the little ViewMasters that you may have viewed when you were a kid, that you'll actually end up with a 3D image in that. So if you look at it through the proper viewer in there to be able to do that, you'll see that. These are very popular during the Civil War, and the Civil War ones are very, very sought after to be able to do that, particularly the ones with the yellow border, because those are the oldest ones in there for that. So there's actually probably the most valuable in there for that. And you know, it's like they typically go for hundreds of dollars a piece. I got this one for, I think, $25 for that one. So I was very, very glad to be able to do that and to be able to pick that one up at a very reasonable price to be able to do that. In addition to that, I also picked up one here of McClellan with his wife in there. I actually have done this image as well. I forgot to put the colorized version of this up, but I've done the colorized version of this one as well as one of the stereo ones that I've reproduced in there for that. So just kind of a neat find to be able to have that in there. There's a close-up of the one side of that in there for that, and then the back of that with describing it with him with his wife in there for that. This is the one of Jenny Wade. The one of Jenny Wade is actually meant to be viewed through the stereo viewer. However, it is not a stereo image. This is the only known image of Jenny Wade to be found. She was the only woman killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was a pure fluke and accident. She was killed inside the house, and so it wasn't something that was expected. She wasn't out on the battlefield or anything. But I mean, today you can go to the Jenny Wade house, and there's quite a bit of a mystique built up around her. So it's kind of an interesting one to be able to see that. There's a close-up of one side of what that image looks like in there for that, and then a little bit of the detail regarding that particular card in there for that. So they typically always had something on the back to be able to describe what they were. In addition to that, I got a graphophone, a graphoscope. This one is designed to be able to view the carte de visite. So that little tiny card that I had showed at the beginning, those, by the way, when you look at them in there, that they're actually the size of a business card. So the original size of that is pretty small to be able to do that. And you can use this to be able to view it in here. So it's just a lot easier to be able to view it through this, obviously, than it is for that. But I picked that up at the auction as well. And then the final thing that I got, which I got at a separate auction, I'm sorry, it was through the same company. It was 2 weeks later. They had another one, and I picked this one up in here for that. Was the hat pin for cavalry pin for that. So of the 8th Cavalry Company E in there to be able to do that. What I thought was interesting, and what I didn't realize, is that it looked like that this is all stamped as one piece in here to be able to do that. But when you look at the back of the pin, you can see that they actually have the 8 and the E are actually produced separately, and then they just have these little tacks that are soldered on to be able to actually hold them all together in there for that. So when you're actually looking at the pin in here, that they actually produce the cross swords and then the numbers and the series of letters, and they just pick out the ones that were appropriate and then just slap them together so they all came out as one piece. But anyway, so that's what I picked up recently, is just a nice little find to be able to do that, and I thought that I would share that here, and just something as a little bit of a nice little thing to be able to pick up and to be able to have. Yes, Anna.
Could I ask you what you were able to acquire is it graphoscope?
Graphoscope, yeah.
The CDVs?
So I don't know if I can see it here. So the graphoscope here was $50. Yeah, everything that I picked up, with the exception of the hat pin. So the hat pin was I don't know if you can see it very well, but the hat pin was listed at $15, and I got it for $22. Everything else I picked up for the minimum bid price on there. So whenever you don't have anybody to bid against you, if you're really interested in the items, I was so worried that somebody would bid against me, and then we'd get into a bidding war. And you know, I had a limit on everything that I was really hard and fast with, but nobody else bid against me. There's several people that had marked it as saying that they were interested in it, but nobody bid against me for any of the other items. So I took everything for the minimum bid. So, you know, can't argue with that. Yeah, absolutely. So that was my find.
All right, Janet.
Mute my. I do have something to share. In 1999, my father, who was an avid coin collector, asked me to help him acquire a piece. He had long been looking at coin shows for a Civil War dog tag. And if you've ever looked at Civil War dog tags, some of them are identified by the soldier that wore them. But he specifically wanted a blank Civil War dog tag. I think he thought that that would be more pristine. They're not worth as much, but and he had spent years at coin shows searching for this and was unable to find it. But in 1999, through the wonders of eBay, I was able to very quickly find one bid on it and get it for him. This is the Civil War dog tag. I'm going to show it. It looks like just a bronze coin. Let me give you a little better shot of it. That's what it looks like enlarged. It is a bust of McClellan, and it has a hole in it at the top so that the soldier could wear it on a string around their neck or whatever. It would be sold by the settlers in the camps. This was not a military issue item. Dog tags were only started being issued in World War One. So this was something that the soldiers would get from a settler because it was something that they felt would be necessary to have on them to identify them, and that they wouldn't be put in an unmarked grave, and that their family could be notified of their death. The back of the item well, not getting the back. It's just a blank planchet, so that they could have engraved on the back of it whatever they wanted. But apparently at the time, McClellan was a big deal in the Union, and having a dog tag with General McClellan on it was a real thing to have. You'll notice that the embellishment there across that says War of 1861. So this was very early in the war when nobody knew how long the war was going to be. So they identified it as the War of 1861 and went from there. And I'll read to you what the seller told me about it. That the soldiers' worst fear was to be an unidentified battlefield casualty. And at the first Battle of Bull Run, many soldiers pinned a slip of paper to their uniforms on which was written their names, units, company and regiment, hometown and state. Shortly thereafter, discs were produced by enterprising manufacturers of tokens, medals, and buttons precisely to be inscribed for soldiers' identification. The settlers used stamping machines for this purpose. In addition to the above basic information, some are found with the soldiers' battles, names of wives or girlfriends, or religious sayings. And often the kind that was shown here contains the battles beneath the bust of McClellan. The various varied designs of Civil War dog tags included famous people like Washington, Lincoln, generals, or patriotic devices like eagles and shields, but McClellan's portrait was very popular. The tags were inscribed by the regimental settlers and sold to the soldiers. Inscribed tags ranged between $500 and $1,000 in price today, and that was 1999. Many tags have been found by relic hunters in campsites or on battlefields. In more than 30 years, the seller only found one. And in my view, they're very historic and scarce and greatly underrated. So in 1999, I was able to get this uninscribed Civil War dog tag for $150 for my dad. And when my dad passed away a couple of years ago, we certainly found this in his collection, and I took possession of it for my collection now. So it's a real relic. It was not identified for any particular soldier, but it may have been found with that of a manufacturer as an unsold item. But I found it interesting that it was identified as the War of 1861, as if it wouldn't go much further than that.
was obviously very early then. I wonder if the reason that it didn't sell is because they realized that the war was going to go on and they had to
Yeah, it was
redo them.
outdated.
Yeah. It's always interesting to find what they thought. Both sides, I think, expected the battle to be over by Christmas and that everybody would go home victorious and they'd be done with. And I also wonder if the reason that it didn't sell is not only was it outdated after 1861, but McClellan's popularity obviously fell off, certainly in 1862 when Lincoln fired him, that it may have just said, well, that's that. Can't sell those anymore.
The manufacturer might have been a Lincoln man.
It's a good thing they kept it around, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do we have
Somebody
other?
kept it in very good condition.
So do we have other stories or relics for this evening? Because I have one to share that's kind of odd. Let me go ahead and tell you. Many years ago, I gave a talk to this round table about the Camel Corps. And while researching things about the Camel Corps, I ran across a story in one collection of things about the camels in Los Angeles that doesn't appear anywhere else and seems to have been based on a newspaper article that came out in the 1860s when the camels were stationed in Los Angeles, some of them at Camp Drum. Well, this last week, one of my other interests is storytelling, and I'm on a listserv with storytellers around the world from English-speaking storytellers. And there was a discussion of Christmas stories that happened where there was no snow, because a lot of the traditional Christmas stories sort of assume you're someplace cold. And I said, well, what about the one with the camels in Southern California? And everyone said, what? And so that reminded me about this story. And I'm going to share with you a short version of it because it's a story that was from this time of the year, literally this week, because it sort of starts at Christmas and ends at New Year's. Now, you probably know that the camels for the United States Army were the brainchild of Jefferson Davis when he was the Secretary of War for the United States. You may not know what really went wrong, and there's a story that I tell about why they were not really popular in Southern California, and it has to do with the fact that camels and horses and mules don't get along well. But the fact was that the Army decided to sell off the camels that were in California, including the ones at Camp Drum, and this sale was to happen in roughly January of 1863. Well, if you've been to Camp Drum or the Drum Barracks, you know that Wilmington is just a little ways inland from San Pedro, the harbor, and that's what it was there to guard. And so a lot of the workers at the port lived in what is now Wilmington near the fort because they either worked at the fort or worked for the shipping setups, and it was a short distance. So there were families not too far from the military facility that were civilian families. And the story goes that it was Christmas, and some of the Hispanic families were going to do posada events, and some of the others were going to do nativity scenes. And well, you know how kids are when you're 8 or 9 years old. You have these ideas, and if nobody's there to stop you, you go ahead with them, even if they're a terrible idea. And these boys from Wilmington had what they thought was the most wonderful plan. They just wanted to borrow a camel or two for the nativity scene and maybe go around with the posada people, and what could go wrong? Now, the camel facilities at Camp Drum, they had a nice enclosure that was not terribly well guarded because, after all, who would try to steal a camel? Now, this was about a week and a half before they were going to be taking the camels away from Camp Drum for sale. So this would have been Christmas Eve or the night before Christmas Eve that the boys thought, this is it. This is our opportunity. They don't want the camels anyway. We'll just borrow them and give them back. And so these boys sneaked into Camp Drum, which wasn't really a fort. It was an encampment where the soldiers lived, but it wasn't like fortified against attack. And they got to the camel enclosure and they opened the gate into the enclosure where the camels were by this time sleeping, and sneaked in to try and wake up a camel or two and borrow them. And that was when things went wrong, because you see, these boys hadn't really thought this through, and none of them had any kind of a harness or anything to put onto the camels to guide them. They were just sort of hoping to be able to get the camels to follow them, like other animals will do. And they went into the enclosure and they woke up one of the camels. And the camel stood up and up and up. And if you've ever been next to a full-sized camel, you'll realize why they realized their mistake at that point in time, because a camel is a lot bigger than an 8 or 9-year-old boy, and they had no way of guiding it. And to make it worse, one of the boys panicked when other camels started standing up too, because the first one had woken them up. The boy screamed and ran out of the camel holding pen, and the camels thought that was really fascinating, and they started to move forward and follow him. And the other boys tried to stop the camels, and well, that didn't work. And the first camel that spat at one of the boys discouraged him, and the other boys went running off too. And so the camels thought, the gate's open, something interesting is going on. And the camels began to follow the boys into the streets of Wilmington. Now, it wasn't that these boys had gone miles and miles. They'd gone a few blocks of distance to where their homes were by modern standards. And the mothers inside the houses heard the strangest sounds outside as these boys were running, screaming up to the doors of the houses and pounding on the doors, asking to be let in. And there was something big moving outside, trampling the gardens. Well, the first mother who opened one of the doors was nearly trampled herself, because children came rushing into her house, some of them her children, some of them not. And there was a big animal in the garden that she eventually realized was a camel, and that there were other camels outside walking along the street and into other people's gardens, munching on things that were edible, trampling on things that weren't. And according to the story, she grabbed a pan and began banging on it to startle the camels and at least get it away from her door. Well, that only works a little bit, because camels don't scare easily either, but at least it didn't try to come into the house. All the children ended up indoors, all the doors got closed. And in the morning, the men who were supposed to be taking care of the camels came out and noticed that the camel pen was open and several of the camels were not inside the facility. And in fact, there were a couple just sort of wandering around Camp Drum looking for interesting things to eat. Well, they gathered up the ones they could immediately find and figured out they're out there somewhere. And camel tracks, being pretty distinctive from anything else, are pretty easy to follow because these streets were not paved. And this being December in Southern California, it wasn't super dry. So they followed the camel tracks and found the camels and eventually brought them back. Complaints were filed on both sides. I mean, parents were saying, your camels terrorized our children. And the army said, well, what were your children doing with the camels in the first place? And the arguments kind of dwindled from there. But the fact was that the camels were sold about a week later. And so that was the only opportunity those children had to borrow a camel for their Christmas. It was a Christmas with no snow and with no camels.
It's a great story.
And for some funny reason, none of the other storytellers had ever heard of this before out of the different stories of uh, Christmas without snow. So we had an interesting discussion of it. But anyway, if you get a chance to go down to Camp Drum, there's the across the street from the drum barracks is a park, and they put camel statues in the park because of the history of the camels in that neighborhood.
I was there for the dedication of that park. It's a nice little park.
One of the few that has camels for the animals, though.
Well, it's appropriate there, though.
Yes.
Did they do camels anywhere else, or just? I mean, I thought they did them in Arizona and a couple of other places. Did they just do them in California? Or do you know where they?
There were
where else
some
they
in
had 'em?
Arizona. There were 2 or 3 places in California. They kept shifting them around, partly because everybody said, why don't you take the camels?
I also heard there were stories of just camels that were found, decades later that were descendants of the original camels that had just survived and were still around for years and years after that.
Well, yeah, see, the thing is, camels don't have any natural predators in North America. And while it's true that a cougar or something could probably kill one with serious effort, they're not going to try. And even like a pack of wolves or something that could take one down don't live in the same areas where the camels were being stored for the most part. A few of the camels were sold up to the Pacific Northwest, but most of them were sold to mining companies up in the north and in Arizona. And a few of them were sold to entertainment groups or people who wanted to use them just for the oddity of having a menagerie with a camel in it. I've been told that some of the ones in Arizona either were let loose or got loose when the different mining facilities shut down. So that's where most of the stories about wild camels come from, is Arizona, because they could live in that climate. Weirdly enough, their only problem was that the Great American Desert has the wrong stuff in it, because camel hoofs are designed for walking on sand, and the desert in Arizona has more of a hard surface. Oh, and Zach had a comment about the camels in Texas. There are different stories about that, about where they came from or why there were camels in Texas, because my understanding is there were actually a few pre-war camels already in Texas that were brought there as part of a bizarre con game, because they brought small numbers of camels in big ships. And apparently that was so nobody would inspect the ship closely and discover that it was also being used to smuggle slaves in. So there were a few camels in Texas that were not part of the Army stuff. And I don't know whether those are the ones the stories come from, because the Army camels were mostly supposed to go west from Texas. Although you never know, they could have been sent back. They were not popular, because the problem is they really don't get along with horses or mules at all.
Nick, I've added a link to the Benicia Historical Museum. Theirs is called the Camel Museum, and they were also housed in Benicia, which is in Northern California in the Bay Area.
Yes. Yeah, there were several sites. They were supposed to be stationed at Fort Tejon, but that was kind of shut down before they really got anything done there. And as far as I can tell, what they were really useful for, which was not the intention, they were really great for carrying the mail between posts, because that way you could have just a camel and a rider and a bunch of stuff. They wouldn't have to be with a caravan of any kind. And the ones from Los Angeles would go out to the places out in the desert where the Indian fighting was being done, and they would travel up the Arroyo Seco, and then east from what is now Pasadena, kind of along the path of where the 210 freeway runs, because there was a natural valley there with occasional water sources. And so when I was doing research on it, from the descriptions of the pathway, that seems to have been how they got out to the desert, was up to where Pasadena is now and then eastward. But yeah, there were several places in California where they were stationed briefly in the cases of people with any kind of a pull, because they got the camels kicked out as soon as they could if they had the authority.
Nick, I don't see any other notices in the chat, but do any of our other audience members have something that they would like to share?
If you will, I have a little quick supplement to what I was talking about earlier
Sure,
with
go
my
ahead.
uncle. I was just looking at one of the little clippings that I had, and I found this kind of interesting. It describes, it says, the winter of 64 and the spring of 65, Mr. Pendleton states that he spent in the trenches that were recently discovered in Virginia. I suppose that means Petersburg, I don't know. The Stonewall Brigade lived in the trenches, cooking, eating, and sleeping in them from November until April. Each army used trenches and dug toward each other. Mr. Pendleton stated that when the brigade of which he was a member would cease digging, a kettle drum would be suspended from a stick fastened in the tunnel, and the drum would reverberate with every stroke of the pick of the enemy, and thus the distance between the two armies could be estimated. Mr. Pendleton says that he supposes the other brigades did the same thing to ascertain where their brigade was. The two armies were so close together, they often exchanged tobacco for coffee. The exchange was made by tying a string to a large plug of tobacco and throwing it across the trench. The package of coffee came back to the Stonewall Brigade in the same manner. All of the fighting was done at night. And then when the trenches left, or when the brigade left the trenches early in April, they saw the city of Richmond go up in flames. On April 9, Mr. Pendleton was one of the soldier boys who stacked arms at Appomattox Courthouse and commenced the weary march to his home at Shepherdstown. He says it was one of the saddest days of his life. I thought that was pretty interesting about the exchange of tobacco and coffee between the armies.
And Mike Hoover, I see you unmuted yourself. Did you have something to add to our discussion or to stories?
Yes, I can tell you the story of one of my relatives. As we become involved in Civil War history, it's just natural to see if we have any relatives that served in the Civil War. And I started researching my father's side of the family. And I found in the 1860 census in a county in North Carolina that my great grandfather was in that census, and he was 1 year old. And on that same census page was his brother, who was 19, and his name was Jefferson Hoover. So that started me off. Hey, in 1860, if you're 19 years old in North Carolina when the war breaks out, chances are you're going to be in the battles. So I started researching him, and through Fold 3 and some other resources, I was able to piece together his history. And in a minute, if I can share the screen, I'll show you an illustration of that. But he was in the 23rd North Carolina Regiment, which eventually became the Iverson Brigade. And He was taken prisoner first at South Mountain, and he was sent to Fort Delaware for a couple of months, and then he was exchanged. And then he appears again July the 1st at Gettysburg. And if I can share my screen, if you'll give me that permission.
You have permissions. You can just go ahead and share it anytime you want there.
Okay, let me see if this image appears for you. Are you seeing a painting there?
Yes.
Okay, what that depicts, and I don't know if my cursor is my cursor showing on this painting?
Yes, I can see
Okay.
your cursor as well.
That is probably Oak Hill. This is the 23rd North Carolina Regiment. He was in, this is the Iverson's Brigade. He was in the 23rd. So on this illustration, and this is Iverson's Death March, you have on this flag would be the 12th, the 20th, the 23rd, which is his brigade, his brigade, and then off to the side would have been the 5th. So the Union here, and I believe these were the 88th Pennsylvania. Iverson's brigade started this march, a very well-dressed march, from the Forney farm, which was right about there. This is a road that parallels his farm. So they were marching down here without sending out pickets, and they were well dressed. And there was a stone wall here. I think this might be a remnant of it back over here, but all the Union guys were laying down behind the stone wall. And when they got to within about 40 to 50 yards of the wall, the Union guys stood up, and you can see them starting to fire in company order. And my great grand uncle was someplace in this illustration along here. Now, the 23rd, when it started out that morning, from what I've been able to determine from the history, is that they had 312 effectives that day. After this very, very short battle, which is basically just a firing squad, 289 of them did not return to the lines. So they were either killed, wounded, or captured. And my great grand uncle, Jefferson Hoover, was one of the 49 prisoners taken. So again, he was sent off to Fort Delaware. And after 2 or 3 months there, I found that he enlisted. I guess he was paroled, and he enlisted in the 1st Connecticut Light Cavalry. So he switched sides. And he fought for, he was in there for about 2 months. And the next thing I find out is that he was captured. So apparently he tried to desert, and he was sent to Fort Jefferson. Fort Jefferson is at the very end of the Dry Tortugas on the Florida Keys. It's one of the last islands out there, just a rock place. And he was there for 11 months. And in March of 1865, he was declared insane, and he was sent to Charity Hospital in New Orleans. So I know, and I've got record of that. So I don't know much about him after that until I was doing some other research, and I came across in the Louisiana State Insane Asylum. If I can put this one over here. I don't know. Are you seeing a census record now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. He was in the 3rd ward of the insane asylum of the state of Louisiana, and he's right down here, second from the bottom. Now, he would have been about 59 or 60 at that point, and they don't know anything about him. Well, there's a lot of them here they don't know anything about, but all they know is he's white, he's male, unknown his birthday or year, unknown, there's some other things here that they don't know where he was born. They don't know the birthplace of his father or mother. They said he cannot write and he cannot read English, but he can speak English. So that was 1900. Now, I was not able to find him anywhere past that. So I contacted the county, the parish of East Feliciana in Louisiana. And that insane asylum is now the state mental hospital. So on a whim, I called them. And I says, I'm just trying to find out something about a guy. Do you have any records of my relative could have been there in the 1900s? And they say, we don't have any there. They're probably in the archives in Baton Rouge. So next time I go to next time I go that way, I'm going to spend some time in the archives. But I did ask them, I said, if you had a patient who is 60 and he died while he was in your care and you didn't know a darn thing about him, where was he interred? And they said, well, we now have two cemeteries. Probably at the time he was in our first cemetery, we would just put him in an unmarked grave out there. So it's almost the end of the story, except my cousin is a director of an organization of hospitals back in the South. And he's familiar with Charity Hospital. And he has a very good friend that is in the leadership or the management of that hospital. And that person has said, I will see if I can try to find out any information about his time here or when he was discharged or where you can find the records. So I'll stop sharing my screen, but that's basically the story of my relative and my quest to find out more about him.
Well, thank you. That's actually pretty cool. I
Yeah,
hope you can find more. I hope you can find more if you can get back there.
yeah, I will. And as a matter of fact, in researching my family, I found out that on my maternal grandmother's side, we had quite a few members who fought in the Confederacy. And I think 5 of the men were there. One of them died in prison up in Ohio, I believe. And the other one survived. And one of them, after the war, who was living in Texas, decided that he would, with his older daughter, he would travel back to Tennessee near Morristown. So he took a wagon trip, and he has a diary of that trip. And there is a portion of it where they were held up at one point, and it turned out to be Cole Younger and Jesse James, who wrote the Cole Younger, the bank robbers and.
Well, the
That would
James
Jesse
and Youngers
James.
yeah, James's and the Youngers worked together a lot.
Okay.
But sometimes Cole Younger had other gangs that he put
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
too.
So from
All out of Missouri.
yeah, so apparently they were held up and they took, the wallets and the purses and the watches, but they let them go. But I've got that diary too. That's an interesting story about their trip from Texas back to Tennessee.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank
Do
you.
we have any other people who want to share their stories or their artifacts tonight?
Yes. I've been spending quite a bit of time on older generations on both of our family sides, however, I think I may have told you that my wife is Choctaw besides Cherokee Creek. However, her family are registered in the Dawes rolls, and as a matter of fact, she's related to 30 of the principal chiefs of the Choctaw Nation. It goes clear back to 1800. And what's interesting about the Choctaws, well, they ended up in Oklahoma, actually Indian Territory, but they came out of Georgia. And what's interesting is they sided with the South. And they apparently were in different regiments, especially towards the end of the war. But I haven't found out any further than that. I've just been, as I've had time, researching on my dad's side, and I've come across a few Union soldiers as well. So, like I said, one of these days I'll have something together that's really going to be, I think, of some interest. What's interesting is I'm finding out things on both sides of the fence. You know, the Civil War was, to me, a big, gigantic family feud. Brothers against brothers, fathers against brothers, and so forth. So it's taking time for us to sort this out, at least from my perspective. Some of you have probably been at this a lot longer. I've only been at it for the last 5 or 6 years.
Well, there's a new book about the Choctaw Confederates. It just came out from University of North Carolina Press. So your wife may want to get that.
Oh, yeah. Tell me what it is. If you know.
It's called Choctaw Confederates. It's by an author named Faye Yarbrough. I just saw an announcement about it, so I knew where to look. But it just came out from University of North Carolina Press.
And it's called Choctaw Confederates.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll look for that. I will not be at all surprised if I don't find some of her relatives in that.
That could happen.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Mike Reed, did you have something to share with us tonight?
Yes, enjoying all these stories and artifacts. Going back to Shepherdstown, West Virginia there with Ed. My wife and I had to us an interesting experience about 2006, 2007. I'll try to be brief. Across the river in Maryland from Shepherdstown is the C&O Canal National Historic Site, which runs from Washington, D.C. up to Cumberland, Maryland, the old canal. Part of that park on the Maryland side opposite Shepherdstown is, I think it's Ferry Hill, a house. And we were driving up in that area on a weekend, just sightseeing. And they had a sandwich sign out front of a road going up to this house. And it said Ferry Hill opened today. And this was a weekend. So we said, let's go up and see what that's about. Turned out that it's Henry Kidd Douglas's home, the Confederate who wrote I Rode with Stonewall, which has some truth to it, I suspect, but also some things that a lot of people consider embellished. So we walked up to walked up to the porch. It's a very, very large house. And there was an elderly gentleman standing on the porch, spoke to us, and told us it was Henry Kidd Douglas's home. In fact, I think in the book, Henry Kidd Douglas mentioned stopping there on his way back from Antietam. So I told him I'd read the book, and he went on to say that he was Henry Kidd Douglas's nephew. He was almost 100 years old.
Wow.
And the house had been, looked like it had been used as an office by the Park Service. There were a bunch of computer cables laying around and a few desks inside one of the rooms, but they were getting ready to renovate it and restore as much as possible. There wasn't any furniture or anything in there, but to see someone and actually speak with someone who's who knew who's a relative of one of the Civil War personalities, we thought was pretty cool.
Great. Well, thank you.
Sure.
And I think some of us probably have copies of that book sitting around.
May I briefly interject with a little historical tidbit because the bit about the Camels got me excited.
Sure.
So hello everybody, Zach Foster. This is my very first Civil War roundtable. Glad to be here. This is a lot of fun. So I had a former job. I used to work as a defense contractor, and I was stationed at the time at Fort Irwin, which is on the California side of the Mojave Desert, up I-15. And it turns out that particular neck of the woods actually has a ton of military history going back to the Mexican-American War. The Mormon Battalion marched through modern day I-15 from Salt Lake City and blah, blah, blah. But as far as the Camel Corps goes, they brought about 80 camels in the 1850s. This was absolutely Jeff Davis's baby. He was Secretary of War, had been trying to sponsor the Camel Corps experiment since he was a senator without success. But as Secretary of War, he had the authority to be able to just do it. So they brought in 2 shipments of Egyptian camels from, they brought them over to Indianola, Texas. And they brought over some Egyptian and Syrian. They were all Ottoman back then. It was the Ottoman Empire. But as far as our maps today, they were Egyptian and Syrian camel herders who were training the soldiers on how to handle all the camels. So they would march them across the North American desert through one of 2 routes. The more common route, they would take them from Texas through the northern New Mexico territory along what's today called the Santa Fe Trail, and then again bring them down through modern day Nevada and the route between I-15 between Southern California and Utah. That was the most common route. The secondary route they took was the later Butterfield stage route, which is where the stagecoach from Texas and then southern Arizona kind of dips into Mexico a little bit before it goes back into Southern California around San Diego and Imperial counties. And the reasons why they dipped so far above or below modern day Arizona and New Mexico is because part of that was still Comancheria or the Comanche territory. Part of it was Navajo territory and part of it was Apache territory. And as far as different Native American nations goes, those 3 particular civilizations had the population numbers to significantly challenge Western and Mexican incursions in the area until basically the Civil War made it, kind of a done deal that those areas were no longer going to belong to the indigenous peoples. But as far as I know, and what I've learned at the Fort Irwin Museum, because they've got a big display there, Bitter Springs, which is inside the modern day Fort Irwin base, is one of the watering holes for the U.S. cavalry back when they were doing the different desert patrols and guarding covered wagons, wagon trains, and guarding mail. They really enjoyed using the camels for work because they were able to go long distances with very little amounts of water. But just like the other gentleman said earlier, just like Nick said earlier, camels don't really get along with horses and mules and whatnot. The horses were absolutely terrified of the camels, and the camels were absolute jerks to the humans. They're very good as work animals, but they're not very sociable. So the Union gradually started selling off the camels, like Nick said, to the mining companies. However, when all the states started seceding and then this interrupted the camel experiment, when Jeff Davis became president of the Confederacy, he used his authority for the Confederate Army to hold on to the camels in Texas as long as he could, because that experiment was his baby. But then, of course, the Union came in and temporarily conquered the area and either sold off or liberated some of the camels. And then over the next couple of months and years, the Confederate camels started showing up in random places like Arkansas, the Dakotas, Colorado. So they got all over the place, but there's a lot of fun history surrounding just the Camel Corps experiment. And thank you for letting me share this with you.
Well, great. Thank you. And thanks for joining us tonight, Zach.
Yeah, hi. That's a great story. My name is Tim, and I tuned in late because I was taking a nap. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Can I jump in now, or do you want me to wait until
Go
somebody
ahead.
else who's been in? Okay. I've been down, I'm 71, and I've lived all over the country, New Jersey, a lot of Revolutionary War history in California, but I only made it down south once about 14 years ago. Southwest Airlines used to not fly into Atlanta. So if you wanted to go to Atlanta, you had to fly into Birmingham and then drive to Atlanta. And it was really a fascinating trip because the road from Birmingham to Atlanta, it's rolling forest, and as I was driving through it and looking outside, it's like I could almost imagine seeing blues and grays hiding behind the trees and puffs of smoke coming out and everything. It's like, I don't know if I was imagining things, but it's like, it was that type of terrain that really made me think, well, that's probably what happened right where I was during the Civil War down there. And, but then I have another kind of interesting story. I got about halfway there and I stopped at a visitor's place to ask about Sherman's March to the Sea, et cetera, et cetera. And the lady told me that Sherman stopped and did some planning, and Sherman ate a meal about the Confederates, what they were going to do. And I thought, well, I've never heard about that. I thought Sherman went all the way through and didn't stop. And you're telling me stopped and ate a meal about the Confederates and met with them? What were they going to talk about? Whether they were going to not march all the way through? And I didn't realize until afterwards, a few seconds later, she had such a heavy Southern accent. When she said ate a meal, I had a meal, he stopped at a mill. And I thought the lady said stopped, ate a meal about the Confederates. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of a humorous little story. But anyway, and I'm an independent sportscaster. I'm a freelance sportscaster. And last year doing a game at South Pasadena High School, I saw something that I've never seen before in a football game. I never dreamed I'd. There was a 15-yard penalty, and the defense backed up, thinking that the offense was going to follow them up to where the 15 yards were. But for some reason, the offense didn't take the 15-yard penalty and went ahead with the scrimmage. So there was about 15 yards there. And the defense turned around and saw that they were scrimmaging. And all of a sudden, as one in one straight line, they ran back to 15 yards to the line of scrimmage. And the first thing I thought about was Pickett's charge. And I was doing the announcing. I was doing the color announcing. And I said, you know, that looks just like Pickett's charge during the Civil War. That was the first thing that struck into my mind. So those are two anecdotal stories. I don't know if they make any sense or not, but those are my two Civil War stories for the night. Thank you.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
And you're right. I've never seen that happen either, where the penalty happens and one side moves and the other one doesn't. That's odd.
But then that was the first thing I thought when I saw them run back there. I thought Pickett's charge, and so that's what I said it looked like.
Yep. Well, do we have any other stories or artifacts for this evening? If not, I want to say happy holidays. Oh, Janet, you had something to say?
Yeah, if we're ending up our meeting, I did want to make an announcement. Mike Hoover is here from the Inland Empire Civil War Roundtable, our sister Civil War Roundtable, whose support and help in our publicity efforts we certainly appreciate. So we're going to give back to them in this season of giving. Their next meeting is Tuesday, January 18th at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. It will be a hybrid meeting in both in person in Redlands and on Zoom. And their speaker is going to be our very own from LA Civil War Roundtables, Dr. Dave Schrader. He's going to be given a program about the Quartermaster Corps during the Civil War. So you can either tune in or drive out to Redlands for that that program. For our own next Civil War Roundtable meeting for Pasadena, it will be an online Zoom meeting, and it will be on January 25th, our normal meeting date of the fourth Tuesday of the month. And we are also featuring Dr. Dave Schrader from the LA Civil War Roundtable, only he's going to talk to us about Lincoln's secretaries. That would be John Nicolay and John Hay. And I think it will be a very interesting presentation. They're not a topic that you get to hear about very much. Similar to the Quartermaster Corps, Dr. Schrader tends to specialize in the little known stories of the Civil War. And I think if you attend either one of those meetings, Inland Empire or ours or both, you're going to be educated about something you probably have not learned much about. So we encourage you to be there for both of those opportunities. They are listed on our website, and the Zoom link is listed in the meeting notice that hopefully you got for tonight's meeting.
All right, thanks, Janet. So,
Yeah, and the only thing I'd like to add to that, can you, when you send out maybe a special Civil War tie-in for the Pasadena one, could you list the links for those two, send them out to all of us so we could remember that? Thank you.
We do include that on our meeting notice. We each exchange each other's meeting information so that we can publicize both roundtables so that you can get double duty for your membership.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I just don't remember seeing that in our notices for Pasadena. I just usually see the Pasadena one. So maybe I missed something, but I'll look close next time.
all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our annual show and tell meeting. And we hope to see you in January. And happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.